black storm coming. See the lightning strike. Black people rising.
What is up with us white people? I've been thinking about that a lot the last few years, and I know I have company. Look, I get it. People of color have been asking that question for centuries. But I think a growing number of white folks are too, given what's been going on out there in our country. And notice I said, what's up with us white people? Because right now, I'm not talking about those white people. The ones with the swastikas and the hoods and the tiki torches. They are a problem and a threat. They perpetrate most of the terrorism in our country, as you all in Charlottesville know better than most. But I'm talking about something bigger, more pervasive. I'm talking about all of us, white folks writ large. And maybe especially people sort of like me, self-described, progressive, don't want to be racist, good white people. Right? Any good white people in the room? I was raised to be that sort of person. I was a little kid in the 60s and 70s, and to give you some sense of my parents, actual public opinion polls at the time showed that only a small minority, about 20% of white Americans, approved and supported Martin Luther King and his work with the civil rights movement while Dr. King was still alive. I'm proud to say my parents were in that group. Race got talked about in our house. And when the shows that dealt with race would come on the television, they would sit us kids down, made sure we watched. The Sidney Poitier movies, Roots. The message was loud and clear, and I got it. Racism is wrong. Racists are bad people. At the same time, we lived in a very white place in Minnesota, and I'll just speak for myself. I think that allowed me to believe that those white racists on the TV screen were being beamed in from some other place. It wasn't about us, really. I did not feel implicated. Now I would say I'm still in recovery from that early impression. I got into journalism in part because I cared about things like equality, justice. For a long time, racism was just such a puzzle to me. Why is it still with us when it's so clearly wrong? Why such a persistent force? Maybe I was puzzled because I wasn't yet looking in the right place or asking the right questions. Have you noticed that when people in our mostly white media report on what they consider to be racial issues, what we consider to be racial issues, what that usually means is that we're pointing our cameras and our microphones and our gaze at people of color, asking questions like, how are black folks or Native Americans, Latino or Asian Americans, how are they doing in a given community or with respect to some issue, the economy, education? I've done my share of that kind of journalism over many years. But then George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin, followed by this unending string of high-profile police shootings of unarmed black people, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, Dylann Roof and the Charleston Massacre, Oscar So White, all the incidents from the day-to-day of American life, these overtly racist incidents that we now get to see because they're captured on smartphones and sent across the internet. And beneath those visible events, the stubborn data, the studies showing systemic racism in every institution we have, housing segregation, job discrimination, the deeply racialized inequities in our schools and criminal justice system. And what really did it for me, and I know I'm not alone in this either, the rise of Donald Trump and the discovery that a solid majority of white Americans would embrace, or at least accept, such a raw, bitter kind of white identity politics. This was all disturbing to me as a human being. As a journalist, I found myself turning the lens around, thinking, wow, white folks are the story. Whiteness is a story. And also thinking, can I do that? What would a podcast series about whiteness sound like? And oh, by the way, this could get uncomfortable. I had seen almost no journalism that looked deeply at whiteness, but of course people of color, and especially black intellectuals, have made sharp critiques of white supremacist culture for centuries. And I knew that in the last 2 or 3 decades, scholars had done interesting work looking at race through the frame of whiteness, what it is, how we got it, how it works in the world. I started reading, and I reached out to some leading experts on race and the history of race. One of the first questions I asked was, where did this idea of being a white person come from in the first place?
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Umoja Circle. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson. I would like to welcome you to another discussion, and I think it's pertinent based on the things that are happening currently in America when it comes to politics and the race issues and the topics that are being, I'm sure many of you are seeing on the internet, dealing with black and white issues and what's going on with people of African descent and the things that are happening to our culture, the attacks that are being made. And there are a lot of pundits, newscasters, normally white newscasters, who always make this statement. And they said, I've never seen America this divided before. Well, because of white privilege, maybe you haven't. But as people of African descent, for us, America has always been divided. And I want to discuss about this in a way that you might not have heard in history class. But again, for those of you who are new to this show, my name is Keith Smokey Johnson, and the purpose of the Umoja Circle is to correct errors where errors are found, and to introduce facts where we find that so many people are working on fiction when it's come to who we are as people of African descent. Now, at the beginning of this show, there was a little video clip, about 6 minutes or so, of a gentleman by the name of, let's see what, I got his name down here, John Bywin. And what he was discussing is something that I think a lot of the people who are, let's just say, in the conservative side of the political arena want not to happen. And that's one of the reasons why they're attacking words that have been used in the black community means to be aware of the surroundings, and you will understand why that word was created when I continue on and describe the origin of racism. That's what it's going to be, and the origin of whiteness. And he's dealing with this reality about facing the facts about what it means to be white in America and the issues that white America has to face. And first of all, why are they called white? Why is there a reason? It was not something that's some kind of fad or some kind of thing that black people called them in opposition to us being black. Blackness came into being during the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, okay, in which those of us who are baby boomers wanted to differentiate ourselves from those people of African descent who have been conditioned by the system to work against our own interests. So how we recognize somebody with a particular behavioral pattern that defends the community, that enhances the knowledge of who we are as people of African descent, who express themselves in a way that reflects our cultural nuances, we will call them black. And blackness, we took that black connotation from the red, black, and green flag that goes back to Brother Marcus Garvey. okay, in the early part of the 1900s. And the blackness part of it, the red, black, and green, the black part would mean unity, oneness, no separation, that we are one people. And it had nothing to do with the color of our skin. That's where a lot of people today get this screwed up. Okay, we understood that we have very different shades of our complexion. But what we call ourselves black, if I see somebody with this complexion, I will assume there should be certain patterns of behaviors that follow what I just said: protect, defend, enhance, and in their actions, and respect our black historical culture. And it's a state of mind that you must have that will develop those behavioral patterns. That's where blackness come from when we call each other black. Otherwise, you're just an African American, some of African descent, but your mind might be really screwed up, just like we have a certain Supreme Court judge who's working against in the kind of law that he's allowing to be put across that's totally different than the person whose slot that he took when Bush put him into office many years ago. I'm talking about Clarence Thomas. He took the spot for Thurgood Marshall, who was a black man, in a way he made sure that there was laws that helped his people in those things, that the Civil Rights Act and all those things. He was a champion of that. That's a black person. What we have in place now is just somebody of African descent. And when we recognize that person, we'll call them a black or a brother or sister, or otherwise we recognize that. So we're not stupid people. So we have our own lexicons, our own way of expressing ourselves. And another word that we also used to use is woke. What it means to be woke means that you've got to be aware of your surroundings. If you're a black man walking this land for the last couple of 100 years, some other people today have hijacked that word and tried to corrupt it, tried to use a terminology that I've used before called semantic infiltration. In other words, they take a terminology that we are talking about in our history and shape it another way. So they start redefining that. And that's part of this political war that's been going on since the founding of this country. Okay, so we got to be aware of that. And when you want to deal with injustice, you deal with injustice by an informed mind. And that's why I do here at the Umoja Circle, to inform you, to let you know that a lot of the stuff that you're seeing in the news media today is a lot of nonsense. And if you don't understand history, history lights the present moment. I always say that. That's why, like today's show, I'm going to discuss what whiteness is. Just like that. And what you saw in that video clip is a white person who's awakened, who's woke. And that's what the conservative people who are against that stuff, who are trying to vilify that term, don't want to happen. Woke white Americans who are aware of the issues that they might not have understood, because this was not taught in schools. What you got was a kind of sanitized creation story that had nothing to do with the reality. American history and black history is one history, but it's a complex and it's a violent history. And it's very, very important that we understand the reality of it. When you go to a psychiatrist, a lot of times in order to heal certain kind of issues, you got to deal with the secrets that you have, right? You got to face those things. That's why you talk to somebody in a quiet room. America has to deal with its conscience, okay? Its original sin. And until we talk about it out loud and start doing all these things to shape ourselves into pretzels, not to address the issue of race in America, then we're going to have this, just like any kind of untreated psychosis, it's going to flare up over and over again. And if you're wondering why we still deal with race, well, we haven't faced the race issue in America. So let's start with my first image here. And like I want you to understand that race in America has always shaped America's concept of democracy, culture, and citizenship. Let's get that straight. Racism is like an infection. If you don't treat it, it's going to contaminate anything else that it touches. And we have not faced the fact. The founding fathers just pushed the stone down the road, kicked it down the road, and even though they wrote this thing called the Declaration of Independence, which produced the structure of American governance, and the Declaration of Independence, which created the philosophical idealism of the American system. But they did not, they were just a bunch of words. But what those words point to was still chaos, especially when it comes to people of African descent. You know, and just like the great Frederick Douglass once said when it came to the 4th of July and the celebration of the 4th of July, when he did a speech in 1850s, he said, what did the Declaration of Independence have to deal with me? What did the 4th of July have to deal with me as a black person, okay? And I did a couple of shows ago, I talked about the Constitution, that it only created a caste system. And I'll try to get into that again, but we're talking about whiteness. Where is the origin of white supremacy and whiteness come from? Let's go on, and I'm discussing, I'm gonna do a 2-part show, so let's go on to the next step. From America's beginning, it was deliberately created to be separated. It was not created to be united. That's the myth that we are taught. You know, the United States, you know, all men are created equal. No, it was deliberately created to separate us. Why then would we be 3/5 of a human being right in the Constitution, where everybody seems to quote today, not really looking at what those words were saying? There was a difference. It was a caste system that was a step hierarchical with white males, okay? White women was below that, then blacks and other were in a different caste. So you're wondering why white men fought in the Civil War, and they didn't own slaves. But they understood that if they became equal to us, then that caste system that was created 80 years earlier in 1787, of the writing of the Constitution, they would be equal to black, and they could not have that. Why? Well, we'll go even further back as the show goes on, because this thing has been indoctrinated into the psyche of America. I want to quote something before we go on. I have a quote that I always use by a great black psychologist that I studied. His name is Dr. Wade Nobles. And he said this thing that's always been profound. I've said it on the show before, but I think this is the moment I want you to understand about the founding generation. That's way before Washington and Jefferson and all those guys. Going back to the beginning of the colonial times. This is where whiteness came into being. He said the action of the founding community or generation become the experience of a generation, okay? That founding, those folks who founded those colonies, okay, become the experience of those people. And the experience of that one generation then becomes the history of the next generation, while the history of many generations that come after them, that follows, become the tradition of the people. And racism was established, whiteness was established in the colonial time. And generation after generation of white domination, of white hierarchy, you're seeing today 200 years or 300 years or 400 years later ingrained in the psyche of white America. That's where you have those Karens who ask and police where black people go, even if we have a FedEx uniform on. She will ask, what you doing here? That comes from laws that were established during colonial times, okay? Let's go on to the next. The history of America can be boiled down to this fact. Rich white men telling poor white people their enemies are black and brown people. That's always been the case. Going back from colonial times to this very day when you have these billionaires doing the exact same thing to distract them, because this is the economic system too. Okay, but it was built on the backs of kidnapped Africans. Okay, human trafficking. That's what slavery was, human trafficking. And if America, how could you be America in the origin story of the land of the free and give us your poor and your downtrodden, but you establish this country on human trafficking? That's the reality that you don't want to face, but you have to face it, and we'll face it in this show. Let's go on to the next. Whiteness and therefore racism was created by the early colonial laws of this land, which have now become unconscious codes of instructions that have been maintained of a 400-year-old hierarchical social order. That's why people you don't have to think about it if you saw your parents do it, your grandparents do it, your great-grandparents. Every generation that came before us, if you're white in America, you were on the top of the hierarchy. You were in the higher caste. That's what you got to understand. And people don't, until you face that truth, like any psychological issue, and understand how can you be all men are created equal when you understand that the system did not function based on those words. It was functioned based on a caste system, no different than India, okay, or the untouchables and what they do to each other in different castes. This is the same thing here in America. It's always been that. It might have been same in Europe when you got nobility and the peasants, the different castes. Same thing was established here. And so this mentality of this was the land of the free or something different, no, it just took another name, but there was this layered structure that was created going back to colonial time. Let's go on to the next. This is an idea, the racism and whiteness and ideology would set up presumed beliefs of the supremacy of one group of people in a society over another group of people. Let's go on. This whiteness, this thing that was established by law now. This is not the arbitrary thing, but by law. And this American creation, white supremacy or racism, has produced a rigid and artificial boundary which for centuries has kept one group of people, white Americans, apart from another group of people, black Americans, based solely on the artificial assumptions of inferiority. Okay, based on the color of the skin. The earliest human beings looked like me, okay? That is scientifically proven today. But yet in this concept that we are somehow not even human, 3/5 of a human. All these social constructs that are a lie. And as long as America lives in this original sin and this lie, how are we going to be united if this truth, just like you go to a psychiatrist, you got to face the secrets, the dark secrets that make you function in that abnormal psychological way. And until we face this truth, America, we go to constantly flare up with these issues. Let's go on to the next thing. This American caste system, like I said, racism, is the infrastructure of our historical racial division. We have a caste system here in America. Till you face that truth, that you could heal it and fix it and know how to deal with it, and won't vote for the same people who want to maintain that system, those who are in power, who don't want to give up that power or perceived power. Let's go on to the next. Racism is a power relationship between two groups, where one group owns so much of the society that they can use this wealth and their power to deprive, hurt, and injure another group. That's what white America has been doing for 400 years, maintaining power based on laws, black codes, and such, okay? Slave codes that told us how to interact with each other, set boundaries, but get the wealth where the other person get non-compensated labor. That's how America got its wealth. That is not equality. That is not unity. That violates those two words. America has an issue with this power relationship to this very day. Why do you think they want to shut down the museums? Why do you think they don't want us to know about this history and taking books off the shelves? Okay, history books. Because black history is American history. And when we speak our experience here, it contradicts the narrative. Let's go on. One of the characteristics of white supremacy ideology is the idea that it is the white feelings, white definitions of things that should fit through reality for everybody else. Other ethnic groups' perspectives, cultural experiences, and reality in America means nothing, okay? Why do you think they wanted to not express ourselves in Black Museum, like the National Black Museum is under attack? black books are under attack because it goes against that white feeling and white definition of who we are. When we use the N-word, came from white folks. Okay? This is what we have to address in order to heal ourselves. It is a disease. It is a cancer, racism, that is affecting the body politics of America. Let's go on. Okay? To prove my point, before I end this first, this is a gentleman that many of you might not recognize, but who he is, let's go on to the next. I'll introduce you to this gentleman. Okay, this is a photograph of the Vice President of the Confederate States of America, Alexander H. Stevenson, okay, whom on March 21st, 1861, in Savannah, Georgia, just a few weeks before the official start of the Civil War on April 12, 1861, gave a speech known today as the Cornerstone Speech. Let's go on to the next, okay. Explaining to this speech explaining to the northern states and to the world that the cornerstone of his new government, the Confederacy, was the belief that the people of African descent in this country, America, never was and never will be the equal to white people, and the enslavement was their normal and natural state. That is what I was talking about when I talked you that Dr. Wade Nobles. It was ingrained in the psyche of people from colonial times, and this is what happened, a couple of hundred years later in 1861, when he was quoting what he knows from his generation and from the generations that came before of white America based on laws like slave codes. This is why he thinks the way he thinks, and still to this day, why Americans think the way they think. Let me go to the next one. Our new government foundation are laid, and its cornerstone, this is his quote, rests upon this great truth, that the Negro did not and never will be equal to white men, a white man, that slavery, subordination to a superior race, white people, is the Negro's natural and normal conditions. This new government, the Confederacy, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. And I'm gonna stop right here and let you kind of soak what he's saying. This is what he said at that Cornerstone speech, and a lot of people who carry that Confederate flag, the Confederacy was based on this ideology, okay? That we are always going to be in the cast of enslavement. In fact, their Constitution, which had everything that the American Constitution had, but it did not have, but it made slavery permanent. What would bring that kind of thinking? But I'm gonna continue on the next show, and you will understand more and more why this is something that is deeper than you might think, okay? And why we're dealing with the issues in today's 2025. So until next time, peace, Hotep, bye-bye.